gagne militairement, mais ça peut aussi se perdre médiatiquement.
ما الذي بقى من ما يسمى بالفقر وغزة؟ ما الذي بقي؟
جرائم أبشع.
Israeli actions in Geneva and elsewhere were undertaken reluctantly and imperfectly against an unrelenting campaign of violence and terrorism.
We must hit the Palestinians with great force and make them suffer great losses, with scores of casualties, so they will feel the enormity of the price.
On the 3rd of December 2001, the Israeli army launched an incursion campaign into Palestinian towns, villages and refugee camps, sealed off those areas and enforced curfews. Soon after, there was an obvious escalation of the Palestinian militants' operations. In a March 2002 meeting, the Israeli cabinet approved the deployment of 20,000 soldiers with hundreds of armored vehicles to the Gaza Strip and West Bank towns and refugee camps. Israel's official objective was to destroy what it calls the infrastructure of terrorism. While doing so, more than 30 Palestinians were killed with the start of the invasion.
Excessive use of force, without a shadow of a doubt, and that was very, very indiscriminate.
A visit to the occupied territories by representatives of Amnesty International coincided with the first invasion. They believed, based on their field experience, it was an attempt to punish the Palestinians.
During our mission during the first incursions in March 2002, one thing we visited, and we had a military man with us from the UK Army, we visited a number of houses and flats which had been occupied by the Israeli army. Now all of those, I would say, that we visited without exception had been trashed by the army, books torn up, thrown on the ground, the doors open, the clothes slashed, the computers broken, the television slapped down.
There was a document found in Hebrew. It was a set of orders issued by a brigadier to his, it's called an operation order. It was found in Ramallah in the mud, but in these orders, allegedly, it is said that you will target electricity generators, you will dig up water mains, you will kill cattle in agricultural colleges, you will destroy certain schools and target certain buildings.
Now, for our military man, this was totally unacceptable and bizarre. It showed he couldn't understand how it had happened. He said either the Israeli army is completely undisciplined, or they have been given orders, or they've been let to know that it's perfectly all right for them to trash apartments like this.
In the 6 or 7 towns that we visited at the end of February, beginning of March, it was identical, almost identical. We almost knew what we were going to see. As soon as we got there, the electricity generators had been knocked out, the road had been dug up. They knew exactly, Israeli forces, if it was Israelis who did it, because they denied it when I asked them, they knew exactly where the water pipes were. They had maps, engineering maps. They didn't have to look very hard to find the main substations, and they dug straight down or blew them up and cut off electricity and water to the towns, and it was repeated. And then schools were targeted and looted, computers smashed, places of education, and Palestinians are great learners, and the literacy rate in Palestine is very, very high, and to destroy the school infrastructure they knew was a punishment.
As soon as they had full control over most Palestinian towns, Israeli troops enforced curfews. Anyone who violated the curfews was at risk of being shot. Journalists, despite their visible identifiers, were at times casualties of Israeli gunfire.
C'est très simple.
International law is quite simple. There are laws for war. Although it's terrifying to say this, but there are laws governing wars, outlined in the form of the Geneva Conventions. Most people don't know what the Geneva Conventions are. These conventions are supposed to make it more difficult to go to war. They state that although it is better not to engage in war in the first place, at least we can still avoid some atrocities of war. The scope of the Geneva Conventions dictates that journalists must be treated as civilians.
They do not receive any special protection, as they should have, because they definitely, and by definition, they do not participate in any of the hostilities and any of the attacks against the soldiers or anything. So they should be protected. And they think that they are exposed to the same open fire regulations, the same policies that the Israeli army has against all the Palestinian population. They have the same policy against journalists. And that's the main problem.
Si un journaliste,
If a journalist, regardless of nationality, is killed by an Israeli soldier, it is considered a war crime. Very simply stated.
The United Nations Security Council passed resolution number 1397, calling for Israel to withdraw from Palestinian towns. "48 hours later, Israeli forces withdrew to the outskirts of the towns they had invaded, keeping the siege and blockade in effect. Israel resorted to assassination attempts against Palestinian activists. Palestinian militants' operations inside Israel became more frequent and severe.
I think one has to notice and explain how it happens that every time when there seems to be a quietening of the situation, a reduction of the violence, every time this happens, the government of Sharon does something which let the whole situation blow up. Some assassination, some act which calls for revenge on the Palestinian side. This needs explanation. Why?
On the 27th of March 2002, soon after a Palestinian bomb attack in Netanya, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon telephoned President George W. Bush to inform him a new invasion is about to take place.
The Israeli army moves forward, always with one eye on Washington. If the Americans don't say stop, there's no limit. And this is what happened with all these Israeli statements and decisions and so on.
The Israeli cabinet held an emergency meeting. Before the meeting was adjourned, a large number of armored and heavy artillery vehicles were advancing towards the West Bank. $20,000 Israeli troops, backed by 20,000 army reservists, started to execute the new military operation, Protective Shield. It was the largest military action in the region since the 1982 Israeli invasion of Beirut. "200 army vehicles invaded the city of Ramallah under Air Force cover.
The daily incursions of their tanks were so horrifying, their movement didn't stop. The tanks caused buildings to shake.
Israeli tanks entered deep from several directions. They raided the city with great and furious speed, but weren't able to take control from the onset.
It was a furious battle. When they bombarded the Chamber of Commerce, we clearly saw the smoke rising from the building. It was quite clear that there were buildings on fire.
Outside, the atmosphere was that of war. Very horrific. Artillery fires, sounds of explosions, clashes, fog, rain, cold.
Panic prevailed among civilians. Many tried to seek shelter in safer places, away from gunfire.
One of them said, "Halt!" I knew it was the Israeli army. "Halt!" in a very thunderous roar, so I stopped. When I pulled the handbrake and made a complete stop, you see, artillery fire became more intense. There were about 20 soldiers. One of them smashed the side glass of the car, aimed at my wife's head, and shot her. She died immediately. May God bless her soul. Then he shot me as well, in the same spot. In the morning, he wanted to take the car and go home. He drove westward to the main street, west to the checkpoint. When he got to the street, it happened. It was obvious that he had no weapons or anything of the sort. He was a peaceful man who never hurt anyone. My wife, Mohsin, may God bless her soul, was holding our boy like this, And when artillery fire started, she lowered him and put him in her lap. He was not hit by any shrapnel, you see. And when the shooting stopped, I opened the door with my left hand. They shot him when he went out to the street and became unexpectedly face to face with the tank. They shot him without asking him any questions whatsoever. I swear to God, witness who went to him can testify to this. He tried to get up, but then he collapsed and died. I didn't see him, but they said it was 3 bullets. They didn't allow his body to be returned back to me, so I can see him. So, Israeli troops were around me, still looking at us. So, when I held the boy like this, he smiled at me. My son, who was 5 days short of completing his 9 months. I tried to run away with Mohsen. But I fell on the hood of the motor, and the troops were still, of course, around looking at me.
Murad's head wound was critical. For 2 hours, medical help could not reach him. No one was able to get through.
The Israeli soldiers were stationed down at the intersection. You see, between me and the ambulance, they were firing at ambulances and the people who came trying to help. They thought that my head wound was in this area. When they saw my head covered with blood and saw me walking without balance, and my movement was not normal, they said he's dying. They wanted to delay the ambulance so that I would die, you see.
Murad and his child were given a new chance for life. But 4 Palestinians were killed and 19 others were wounded during the first few minutes of the invasion.
There were snipers firing at anything that moved. A person, an animal, a plant, a tree, any noise. At anything. There was intense and rampant artillery fire. We could hear it. All the people living in these buildings went hiding in the inner rooms.
Each one of us felt like we could be a target at any time. At any moment, one could be a victim. This created a kind of feeling of being oblivious to the place and the time and to everything. It felt like you were waiting for a certain moment, and out of sheer natural instinct for survival, we as mothers used to hold our children to protect them from something mysterious, something that could target them at any time.
The children had the right to see that. You know how their city were on their siege and they were 24-hour curfew. So these children are being sort of raised within this environment, and certainly is something that is going to affect all their lives.
Immunity of the civilian population. The prohibition of attacks against the civilian population as such, or against individual civilians, is a general rule, applicable in non-international armed conflicts. Acts of violence intended primarily to spread terror among the civilian populations are also prohibited.
The first care for the IDF at that point, even during military operations, was for the safety and protection of the civilian population, both as the occupying force, but both in terms of the laws of armed conflict. That is their first and primary duty.
The armed actors have the duty to protect civilian population and to keep them out of risk. And the minimum thing I can do is to inform them of the risk. And that was not done.
Shooting continued in the city until the following morning.
It was quite possible if you were closing the window shutters at the same moment a tank drove by, they would fire at you.
On the morning of March 30th, 2002, media outlets were broadcasting images of 5 Palestinians who seemed to have been executed.
I saw all 5. I saw them 4 hours before they died. At that time, I was trying to start the power generator because power was cut off. So I saw all 5 of them. We felt the presence of the Israeli army, tanks and armored vehicles. There was intense artillery fire in the building for about 1 hour. I was taken back when I saw the 5 corpses, each in a corner, their ages all above 50. There were bullets. I approached the one with a bullet in his head, around here. I came closer and saw that the injury was as if he was made to stand in a certain way, and they shot at his head and the blood gushed, splashing the walls. The second, when I lifted his shirt, I saw his chest riddled with bullets. The third had signs of an explosion near his head. His head was almost crushed. As for the rest, their heads were covered. The walls were splattered with blood and riddled with bullets. When I saw this, I immediately ran back to the office and took a camera and videotaped them. I called for an ambulance to take them. They said they would be there soon. Then the Israeli troops came back to the building and said to me, "We advise you, it is neither in your interest or the paramedics if the ambulance arrives while we are still here."
Those men were not armed. They went inside a building seeking shelter from the shelling and snapfire.
They were not armed in the first place. It was like I told you. I saw them and they did not have any type of weaponry.
By noontime, bodies of dead and wounded Palestinians were scattered throughout the streets of the city. No one could come near to help.
It was madness, madness, sheer madness. It was like you just sit and count the rockets, count the rockets. This one fell here, that one landed there. This one's an air missile, that one's a mortar shell. You tremble and you shake and you feel like your life is trembling as well. It was like an earthquake, worse than an earthquake. The earthquake would last for a moment and then disappear. But this was madness in the full sense of the word. You just sit and wait for death.
Israeli forces started firing at journalists again.
Because Israel, like many other countries, understood that war, and it is a real war, could be won militarily, but lost in the media, it, Israel, owns an effective media front. What took place in April 2002 during the massive invasion of the city of Ramallah against the various media outlets, Arabic, Palestinian, and international alike, affirms the objective to silence the voice of journalists who report the truth. In the month of April, the offices of Al Jazeera came under fire twice. There were raids on the offices of NBC and Nile Television, along with attacks on several other offices, including Palestinian production companies.
Excuse me, can we go through? No, you must go away. You must go away.
I went out around 7:30 with Carlos, the cameraman, a colleague of mine. On the morning of March 29th, we headed to the office of President Arafat. We were in a large GMC van. There were more than 6 large TV stickers on it, terms recognized by all to indicate press and journalists. We saw a Palestinian ambulance. In the distance, I saw an Israeli tank inside the district's headquarters. I tried to videotape it. In fact, I did. We were sure we and everything around us will not be hit, as there were an ambulance nearby. It would be impossible for them to shoot at an ambulance or a press vehicle. Within seconds, artillery fire became intense at our vehicle, at us, inside the vehicle. Another bullet and another bullet. There were about 12 shots fired by then, one after the other. I was hit. 4 bullets hit me in the lower jaw, breaking it. Another bullet hit me here in my neck and cut off the artery that feeds blood to my brain. Another hit my shoulder here, and another here. I almost lost consciousness. Rad rushed out to fetch the ambulance nearby. All of a sudden, he returned yelling. And I'll never forget this. The paramedics need paramedics. The ambulance door, the ambulance next to us was also hit. The door was open and the paramedic was dangling lifeless. I think he was dead. I'm talking to you about definite patterns of cases when journalists were wounded. We have all the elements that enable us to present the evidence with certainty that the whole thing was started by a gunshot fired by the Israeli army. Secondly, we can safely say it was impossible for the person who opened fire not to know the person he was shooting was a journalist. Therefore, it was a premeditated murder.
Reporters Without Borders in Paris and the Organization for the Protection of Journalists in New York began to investigate who was directly responsible for the targeting of journalists.
We, journalists with Sans Frontières Journalist Organization, have asked ourselves the question about the leadership network in Israel. Who was in charge and is held accountable? Finally, we all agreed, taking into consideration information we had about the substantial influence of the army in Israel, that it was the chief of staff of the Israeli army who should be held accountable. We saw that the chain of command reached that level. It was obvious that there was political responsibility. As for the judiciary, political responsibility is another matter. We can also assert that the Israeli parliament member who voted for Sharon, or that Mr. Sharon who appointed the Minister of Defense, or that the Minister of Defense himself is responsible. They are all responsible. However, in our point of view, it is possible to specifically hold the whole network of the Israeli military leadership responsible. The military specifically. We see that responsibility has reached this far. And it is on this level that we should ask for an explanation.
Article 79. Journalists engaged in dangerous professional missions in areas of armed conflict shall be considered as civilians. They shall be protected as such under the conventions and this protocol, provided that they take no action adversely affecting their status as civilians.
The scope of the Geneva Conventions dictates that journalists must be treated as civilians and have the same civil rights. What does that mean? In reality, this means that a journalist must not be a target for soldiers. And it means also that we cannot explain how a journalist appeared to a soldier as a fighter and how he treated him as a fighter. It is obvious from the frequency and upsurge of such actions that there was a deliberate policy to silence journalists or to stop the media from reporting on what really happens. Violating the Geneva Conventions is indeed a war crime. It goes without saying, when one violates such conventions, one commits a war crime. Consequently, the International Penal Code punishes for this crime.
On the 30th of March, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution number 1402, calling on Israel to stop its military operations and withdraw from Ramallah.
Заседание закрывается.
The Israeli cabinet met on the 28th of March 2002 and decided to start a wide operation aimed at uprooting the infrastructure of terrorism in the Palestinian territories. We will wipe out terrorists, their infrastructure and organizations. The Israeli army resumed its military operation, Protective Shield, in the city of Qalqilia.
This military invasion had nothing to do with security as is claimed by the Israeli side. No arrests were made and there was no hunt for wanted individuals. It was obviously a methodology to cause destruction and devastation to the city. Israeli tanks entered the city. It was obvious there was an intent to destroy everything that came in the way of those tanks. Power networks were destroyed. Most of the sidewalks and pavements were damaged. All the traffic lights in the city were smashed and destroyed. And in many cases, telephone lines were cut off.
It's against the law. It is against the law to punish the civilian population. It is against the law to poison water supplies. It is against the law to do all of these things, cut off electricity. It is against the law. That's clear. Secondly, you will never win. This tactic will never, ever win. No army in the world has ever beaten a civilian population into submission.
In less than 24 hours, the Israeli army had full control of the city.
The headquarters of Medical Relief Center in the city of Qalqilia was raided. Fully armed troops violently stormed into the headquarters and broke down or blew open doors and vandalized specialized clinics at the Medical Relief Center. They also vandalized equipment and destroyed devices, medicines, and medical files. There were losses in private properties and possessions of residents. About 51 inhabited houses were blasted and completely demolished.
In the same manner, Tulkarm was the third Palestinian city to be entered by the Israeli army, with more than 60 armored tanks and hundreds of soldiers.
The city was completely brought under strict control, with particular emphasis on the refugee camp of Tulkarm. The army didn't only target anything that moved, but also buildings, electricity poles, hospitals, and schools. Tanks were firing their machine guns. Intermittently, they would fire mortar shells. 17 martyrs fell on the same day. At the beginning, of course, we did not comprehend the whole situation. The martyrs and wounded were all over the streets. We found more than one martyr whose body has been lying on the street for 3 days. Here, martyrs would remain on the streets for a whole day before an ambulance was able to arrive and take them to the hospital.
There were attacks on ambulances, attacks on medical personnel. During these incursions, for instance, we went to Tulkarm, where 2 ambulances had been shot at, and 2 people driving in the ambulances had been shot during the same day. And there, the head director of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society said, during the next day, not a single people were lying wounded and dying on the streets, and not a single ambulance left this depot. I couldn't give any orders for ambulances to go.
The situation was not much different from the medical teams in Ramallah. No team, international or local, was able to rescue a wounded person or remove a dead body.
There were lots of cases that ambulance could not pass, and sick people were stopped at checkpoint for hours, and in many cases ambulances cannot get into places, and in many cases ambulances were shot.
Children got sick and the ambulances could not reach them. You receive news your friend who is a medical doctor has been arrested. Now if a doctor has been arrested, what next?
The International Red Cross sent formal letters to the Israeli government accusing its forces of deliberately targeting medical teams. The Israeli government failed to reply or to show it is taking measures to prevent such practices.
The aim of the occupying Israeli army was to cause the greatest number of casualties among Palestinians. Targeting the injured and the wounded by denying them immediate medical care means you have condemned those people to death.
The situation in other Palestinian towns fared no better. People in Beit Lahem felt something was awaiting them.